In 1976, the British government was running out of money. Inflation was at 25%, the pound was collapsing, strikes were shutting down public services. The Prime Minister at the time, James Callaghan, stood before his own Labour Party conference and said something that no British leader had said in a generation. We used to think that you could just spend your way out of a recession. I tell you, in all candor, that option no longer exists. Why did he say that? Because the International Monetary Fund had told him to. Britain, one of the founding members of the global financial order, a permanent member of the UN Security Council, a nuclear power, had gone, hat in hand, to the IMF and asked for a bailout. And the IMF gave it to them, but not for free. In exchange for $3.9 billion, the largest loan in IMF history at that time, Britain had to cut public spending, raise interest rates, and sell off state assets. The welfare state that the British had built after World War II began, that day, to be dismantled. If this happened to Britain, imagine what happens to countries with far less power. Imagine what happens to Ghana, to Argentina, to Pakistan, to Sri Lanka. Today, we are going to follow the money. We are going to look at exactly how the IMF works. Not in theory, not according to its official website, but in practice, in the real world, in the decisions that changed millions of lives without those people ever voting for them. Born at Bretton Woods, the year is 1944. World War II is not yet over, but the Allied powers are already planning what comes next. In July of that year, 730 delegates from 44 countries gathered at a hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission? To design a new global financial system that would prevent the economic chaos of the 1930s from ever happening again. The Great Depression had taught them something terrible. When one country's economy collapsed, it dragged others down with it. Countries had responded by raising trade barriers, devaluing their currencies, and turning inward. The result was not recovery. It was a race to the bottom that helped bring fascism to power across Europe. The architects of Bretton Woods wanted to build something different, a system of cooperation, a set of institutions that could stabilize the global economy. Two institutions emerged from those 3 weeks of negotiations. The World Bank, which would lend money for long-term development projects like roads, dams, and schools, and the International Monetary Fund, which would manage short-term financial crises. When a country ran out of foreign currency and could not pay its international debts, the IMF would step in with emergency funds. The man who designed much of the IMF's architecture was a British economist named John Maynard Keynes. He argued that countries in crisis should not be forced to destroy their economies to get help. The loans should come with minimal conditions, just enough to ensure repayment. The Americans disagreed. Their negotiator, Harry Dexter White, wanted the IMF to have more teeth, more conditions, more power to reshape the economies of borrowing countries. White won the argument, and that decision, made in a hotel in New Hampshire in 1944, is still shaping the lives of people in Lagos, Karachi, and Buenos Aires today. The IMF has 190 member countries. On paper, it looks like a democratic institution. Every country has a vote, but not every vote is equal. Voting power in the IMF is determined by something called quota, essentially how much money each country has contributed to the fund. And the quotas were set in 1944 based on the economic size of countries at the time. The United States holds approximately 17% of total voting power. The entire continent of Africa, 54 countries, holds less than 7%. Here's why that matters. The IMF's most important decisions require an 85% supermajority, which means the United States alone has veto power over every major IMF decision. Every single one. The IMF's managing director has always been a European. The World Bank's president has always been an American. This is not written in any official rule. It is an unspoken agreement between the Western powers who designed the system and have dominated it ever since. This is the institution that walks into countries in crisis and tells them how to run their economies. Chapter 3. On why countries need the IMF. To understand why countries go to the IMF, you need to understand one concept, the balance of payments crisis. Every country in the world conducts trade with other countries. You buy oil, you sell textiles. You receive foreign investment, you send remittances. All of this creates a flow of foreign currency in and out of the country. A country needs foreign currency, usually dollars, to pay for imports, service its external debt, and maintain confidence in its own currency. If the foreign currency runs out, the country is in a crisis. This can happen for many reasons: a commodity price collapse, a drought that wipes out exports, a sudden withdrawal of foreign investors, a war, a pandemic. Whatever the cause, the result is the same. The country cannot pay its bills. It cannot import medicine, fuel, or food. Its currency collapses. Inflation explodes. Companies shut down. People lose their jobs. The government desperately needs foreign currency quickly. And there are very few places that can provide billions of dollars in a matter of weeks. That is where the IMF comes in. Chapter 4. The Loan Agreement. When a country approaches the IMF for a loan, it enters a negotiation. The IMF sends a team of economists to the country. They examine the books, government budgets, trade deficits, inflation figures, debt levels. Then they produced something called a letter of intent, a document in which the borrowing country describes in detail the economic policies it will implement in exchange for the loan. Notice the structure of that sentence. The country describes the policies it will implement, but in practice, those policies are written by the IMF economists. The country's government signs them, then the document is presented to the world as the country's own plan. The loans come in tranches, installments released over time, contingent on the country meeting specific conditions. If the country fails to meet those conditions, the next tranche is withheld. This creates extraordinary leverage. The country is already in crisis. It needs the money now, and the IMF can turn off the tap at any moment. Chapter 5. What are structural adjustment programs? Beginning in the 1980s, the IMF began packaging its loan conditions into formal programs called structural adjustment programs, or SAPs. The name sounds technical and neutral. The consequences were anything but. A standard structural adjustment program typically required a country to do several things simultaneously. First, austerity cut government spending, reduce the budget deficit. This almost always meant cutting subsidies on food and fuel, the things that kept basic survival affordable for the poorest citizens. It meant cutting public sector wages, reducing health budgets, reducing education budgets. Second, privatization. Sell state-owned enterprises, the government's water company, electricity company, telephone company, national airline. Sell them. The theory was that private companies run things more efficiently than governments. The reality was often that these companies were sold at below market prices to foreign investors, and then prices for essential services rose dramatically. Third, trade liberalization, remove tariffs and trade barriers, open the domestic market to foreign competition. The theory was that competition would make local industries more efficient. The reality was often that local industries, unable to compete with heavily subsidized foreign products, collapsed entirely. Fourth, currency devaluation. Make the local currency cheaper relative to the dollar. This was supposed to make exports more competitive. It also made imports, including medicine, fuel, and machinery, dramatically more expensive. Fifth, raise interest rates. High interest rates reduce inflation in theory. They also make it impossible for local businesses to borrow money and invest, which kills economic growth. Taken individually, each of these policies has a theoretical justification. Taken together, applied simultaneously in an economy already in crisis, they had consequences that the IMF economists in Washington did not live with, but the people of Ghana, Zambia, and Bolivia did. Case study 1, Ghana. The country that did everything right, 1983-2000. In 1983, Ghana was in genuine crisis. Drought had destroyed the cocoa harvest, the country's main export. Oil prices were high. The government was broke. Inflation was over 120%. Food was scarce. Ghana turned to the IMF. Under the leadership of Jerry Rawlings, a military leader who had taken power in a coup, Ghana implemented one of the most comprehensive structural adjustment programs in African history. The government cut spending aggressively. It privatized dozens of state enterprises. It devalued the cedi repeatedly. It removed food and fuel subsidies. By the mid-1990s, the IMF held Ghana up as a success story. GDP growth returned, inflation fell. The international financial community praised Ghana's commitment to reform. But here's what the success story left out. Throughout the adjustment period, real wages for Ghanaian workers fell by over 40%. Health spending per capita was cut so severely that maternal mortality rates, the rate at which women die in childbirth, actually increased during the 1980s and early 1990s. Primary school enrollment fell. The cocoa farmers who had been the backbone of the Ghanaian economy found that while they were now selling into a liberalized market, the processing and export of cocoa remained controlled by the same multinational corporations. Ghana grew the cocoa. Foreign companies extracted the value. A 2004 study by the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, found that structural adjustment in sub-Saharan Africa was directly linked to what they called adjustment with a human face, a polite phrase for the collapse of healthcare and education for the poorest people. Case study 2, Argentina. When following the rules destroys you, 1990s, 2001. Argentina in the 1990s was the IMF's star pupil. The country had fixed its currency to the dollar. A peso was worth exactly $1, a policy called convertibility. It had privatized its state enterprises on a massive scale. It had opened its markets. It had cut government spending. The IMF praised Argentina repeatedly. When in 1998, IMF Managing Director Michel Camdeses called Argentina's economic reform a model for other countries to follow. 3 years later, Argentina defaulted on $100 billion of debt, the largest sovereign default in history at that time. In December 2001, the government froze bank accounts. People could not access their savings. Within 2 weeks, the government fell. Then another government fell. Argentina had 5 presidents in 2 weeks. What happened? The peso dollar peg that the IMF had praised made Argentine exports uncompetitive. When Brazil, Argentina's largest trading partner, devalued its own currency in 1999, Argentine goods became twice as expensive compared to Brazilian goods overnight. The economy began contracting. The IMF responded by demanding more austerity. Cut spending further, the government obeyed. The economy contracted more. Tax revenues fell, the deficit grew. The IMF demanded more cuts. This is what economists call the austerity trap. The medicine is killing the patient, but the doctors keep prescribing more medicine. When the crisis finally hit in December 2001, the IMF initially withheld a $1.26 billion loan tranche, citing Argentina's failure to meet fiscal targets. In the middle of the worst economic crisis the country had seen in a generation, the IMF cut off the money. The unemployment rate hit 25%. The poverty rate hit 54%. An estimated 26 people died in the riots that followed the crisis. Case study 3, Zambia, the copper. That couldn't save itself, 1980s, 2000s. Zambia, at independence in 1964, was one of the wealthiest countries in sub-Saharan Africa. It had the copper belt, one of the richest mineral deposits in the world. The government used copper revenues to build hospitals, schools, universities, and roads. Life expectancy was rising, literacy was improving. Then copper prices collapsed in the mid-1970s. Zambia borrowed heavily to maintain spending. By the 1980s, it was drowning in debt. The IMF arrived with a structural adjustment program. The government was told to privatize the copper mines, cut subsidies, reduce the public sector, and liberalize the economy. The copper mines were sold. The Zambia Consolidated Copper Mines, ZCCM, which had employed 60,000 people and had funded much of the country's government revenue, was broken up and sold to private companies, primarily to Swiss Commodities, giant Glencore, and Anglo American. What happened next is instructive. The private companies invested little in the mines. They extracted copper. They paid minimal taxes through complex corporate structures. They did not reinvest in Zambian workers or communities. By the late 1990s, Zambia had lost most of its industrial capacity. Unemployment had exploded, copper production had fallen, and Zambia's debt, despite 2 decades of structural adjustment, was larger than it had been when the programs began. In 2005, under the Heavily Indebted Poor Countries Initiative, an international debt relief program, Zambia finally had significant debt canceled, not because the structural adjustment had worked, but because it so clearly had not. I want to be honest with you, because this is not a simple story with clear villains. There are serious economists and serious arguments on the other side, and if we ignore them, we are doing the same thing we are criticizing, presenting only half the picture. The defenders' argument won. Someone had to lend. The countries that came to the IMF were often in genuine fiscal crisis. They had borrowed too much. They had spent money they did not have. Their governments were corrupt or incompetent or both. Without any intervention, the crisis would have been even worse. Who else was going to lend? Private capital markets had shut their doors. Bilateral lenders, China, the Gulf states, were not yet playing a major role. The IMF was often the lender of last resort when there was genuinely no other option. The defender's argument, too, conditions are necessary. If you lend money to someone without conditions, you are not helping them. You are enabling them to continue the behavior that caused the crisis in the first place. Conditions exist to ensure that the borrowed money is actually used to fix the problem, not to fund more spending that will require another bailout in 3 years. The countries that defaulted, despite IMF programs, often defaulted because they did not implement the conditions fully, not because the conditions were wrong. The defender's argument 3, the IMF has changed. The IMF of 2024 is not the IMF of 1985. The institution has acknowledged failures. Its own internal evaluation office, the Independent Evaluation Office, has published damning assessments of structural adjustment programs in Africa and Asia. Current IMF programs are supposed to include social spending floors, minimums below which health and education spending cannot fall. The institution now officially acknowledges the importance of inequality as a macroeconomic risk. Former Managing Director Christine Lagarde explicitly apologized for the IMF's handling of the Greek crisis. That is remarkable for an institution of its kind. These are not trivial concessions. They represent real institutional learning. So, what is the honest assessment? The IMF is not a conspiracy. It is an institution staffed by intelligent people who genuinely believe or believed that the policies they were recommending were correct. But it is also an institution with structural biases. It is controlled by wealthy creditor nations. It applies to borrowing countries policies that those wealthy nations would never accept for themselves. When the United States ran enormous deficits in the 2000s and 2010s, no one from the IMF flew to Washington and told the American government to cut Medicare and raise interest rates. The conditions are applied to the weak by the strong. That asymmetry, more than any conspiracy, is the real story. Here is the most damning statistic in this entire video. Argentina has borrowed from the IMF 22 times since 1956. Pakistan has borrowed from the IMF 23 times since 1958. Ghana has been under IMF programs for over 30 of the last 45 years. If the purpose of an IMF loan is to fix a country's economic problems, so it never needs another loan, then these numbers represent a catastrophic failure. But here's the question you have to ask. Is the failure of the program or the design of the system the structural trap? Here is the mechanism that keeps countries returning. A country takes an IMF loan. It implements the conditions: austerity, privatization, trade liberalization. The immediate crisis is resolved. The country can pay its bills, but the structural conditions have left the economy weaker. Local industries have collapsed under foreign competition. Privatized essential services have become too expensive for the poor. Reduced government spending has undermined long-term human capital, the education and health that drives future growth. Meanwhile, the loan must be repaid with interest in dollars. If the country's exports have not grown enough to generate those dollars, and structural adjustment often reduces export capacity in the short term, then the country needs to borrow more dollars to repay the existing loan, and the cycle begins again. This is not hypothetical. The IMF's own data shows that low-income countries today collectively spend more on debt service payments, interest, and principal than they spend on healthcare. Who benefits from this cycle? Follow the money. When a country takes an IMF loan, the money does not usually go to feed people or build schools. It goes to pay existing creditors, Western banks and bondholders who lent money to the country in the first place. So the sequence is, Western banks lend money to a developing country. The country cannot repay. The IMF steps in with a loan. The IMF loan is used to repay the Western banks. The country now owes the IMF instead. The IMF attaches conditions that open the country's economy to foreign investment. Foreign companies, largely Western, buy the privatized assets. At every stage of this cycle, the money flows from the developing country toward the wealthy world. That is not a conspiracy theory. That is the documented flow of capital, visible in the data published by the institutions themselves. Something significant is shifting in the global financial system. And it is changing the IMF's leverage, though perhaps not in the way you might hope. China as an alternative lender. China, through its Belt and Road Initiative and its state-owned banks, particularly the China Development Bank and the Export-Import Bank of China, has lent hundreds of billions of dollars to developing countries over the past 2 decades. On the surface, this looks like competition to the IMF. And it is. Countries facing a balance of payments crisis now sometimes have an alternative. They can turn to China instead of Washington. But Chinese lending comes with its own conditions and its own problems. The loans are often tied to the use of Chinese construction companies and Chinese workers. The contracts are frequently confidential. Citizens of the borrowing country cannot see the terms their government has agreed to. When countries struggle to repay, the renegotiations happen behind closed doors. The famous case of Hambantota Port in Sri Lanka, where a struggling Sri Lanka signed a 99-year lease on a strategic port to a Chinese state company in lieu of debt repayment, has become a symbol of what critics call Chinese debt trap diplomacy. Though it is worth noting, the Sri Lankan government chose to build that port against the advice of its own economists and sought Chinese financing when Western lenders refused. The story is more complex than the simple debt trap narrative. The BRICS, New Development Bank, the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, and newer members, have established the New Development Bank as an alternative to the World Bank and IMF. The NDB claims to lend without the political conditions attached to Western institutions. Whether it can actually replace the IMF's role for countries in acute balance of payments crises remains unproven. The institution is still small. Its lending capacity is a fraction of the IMF's. What these alternatives have created is not a replacement for the Western-dominated financial order, at least not yet. They have created leverage. Countries now sometimes use the possibility of going to China to negotiate better terms from the IMF. Whether that pressure is enough to genuinely reform the system is the central question of the next decade of global finance. Let us come back to where we started, Britain in 1976. A rich, powerful country brought to the IMF by a genuine crisis and forced to change its economic model. Now multiply that experience. Imagine it happening to countries with a fraction of Britain's institutional strength, with corrupt governments, with no history of stable democracy, with commodity-dependent economies, with populations already living on the edge of subsistence. Imagine it happening not once, but repeatedly for decades. The IMF is not evil. It is not a conspiracy. It is an institution that reflects the interests of the countries that created it and continue to fund it. It applies economic theories that were fashionable in the 1970s and 1980s with a rigidity that ignored the human consequences. And it has done so with relative impunity because the people who suffered most from its programs had the least power to change them. The fundamental question the IMF raises is one of sovereignty. When a country is desperate, when it cannot feed its people or pay its civil servants, how much of its right to make its own decisions should it be forced to surrender in exchange for help? The IMF's answer, for most of its history, has been quite a lot. Whether that answer is changing, whether the institution that was born in a New Hampshire hotel in 1944 can adapt to a world where power is shifting, is a story that is still being written. But now you know how the mechanism works. And knowing how a system works is the first step toward deciding what you think should change about it. If this video made you want to understand more, the next video in this series goes deeper into the World Bank. Same system, different mechanism, equally important story. Like this video if you learned something you did not know before. Subscribe if you want to keep following the money. I will see you next time.